e4. King's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. e6. French defense, opening line. The French defense accepts a certain lack of mobility in exchange for resilience and solidity. d4. French defense, normal, opening line. White must either now or later take this step. Control of center, quick opening lines. d5. French defense, opening line. This is the strong point of the French defense. Capture it, bypass it, but don't ignore it. Knight c3. French defense, Paulson variation, opening line. Knight f6. French defense, classical variation, opening line. e5. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. Steinitz put his mark on the French defense from the white side. 4e5 followed by f4 was his method of burying this recalcitrant defense. Knight f d7. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. f4. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. c5. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. Knight f3. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. Knight c6. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, opening line. Bishop e3. French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, Boleslavsky variation, opening line. Bishop e7. Out of opening book. C takes d4. Would have been in the French defense, classical variation, Steinitz variation, Boleslavsky variation, book opening. Makes way for a castle to the king's side. a3. a6. D takes c5. Knight takes c5. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop e2. Makes way for a castle to the king's side. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. b5. Queen e1. b4. Threatens white's knight at c3. A takes b4. Protects white's knight at c3. Attacks black's knight at c5 and isolates black's pawn at a6. Knight takes b4. Protects black's knight at c5 and attacks white's pawn at c2. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight d4. Removes the threat on white's pawn at c2 and blocks black's pawn at d5. Bishop d7. Knight d1. Threatens black's knight at b4. a5. Protects black's knight at b4. Knight f2. Takes the knight away from the edge of the board. f5. King h1. Knight e4. c3. Attacks black's knight at b4. Knight c6. Moves it out of immediate danger. Knight takes e4. D takes e4. Creates a passed pawn on e4. Black wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Knight b5. Queen b8. c4. Advances the passed pawn. Knight b4. Rook d1. Attacks black's bishop at d7. Rook d8. Removes the threat on black's bishop at d7. Queen f2. Bishop takes b5. C takes b5. Advances the passed pawn. White wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. Knight d5. Bishop c4. Queen b7. b3. a4. B takes a4. Creates a passed pawn on a4. Rook takes a4. Attacks white's bishop at c4 and isolates white's pawn at b5. Bishop takes d5. Forks black's pawn at e6 and black's queen. E takes d5. Removes the threat on black's queen and creates a passed pawn on d5. Black wins a bishop and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Material is even. b6. Moves it out of immediate danger and pushes the passed pawn. Rook c4. Seizes the open file. Bishop d4. Blocks black's pawn at d5. Queen c6. Queen e3. Blocks black's pawn at e4. Rook b8. Rook c1. Partially pins black's rook at c4. Bishop d8. Rook takes c4. Attacks black's queen. D takes c4. Removes the threat on black's queen and advances the passed pawn. Black wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Rook b1. Moves it behind the passed pawn at b6. c3. Pushes the passed pawn. Queen takes c3. Attacks black's queen. Queen takes c3. Attacks white's bishop. Bishop takes c3. Rook takes b6. Attacks white's rook. Rook takes b6. Bishop takes b6. Black. Bishop takes b6. Black wins a queen, a rook, and a pawn for a queen, a rook, and a pawn. Material is even. g3. King f7. King g2. King e6. Blocks white's pawn at e5. King f1. King d5. King e2. g6. h3. Bishop d8. Bishop d2. h6. h4. h5. The game ends in a draw.